Good evening, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Church. I'm the Vice President Academic here at Mount St. Vincent University, and I'd like to welcome you to Part 3 of Sex and the Citizen. We're delighted to have you here, and we're delighted to be partnering with CCEPA, the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs. And when we first started thinking about this series, we were really interested in how ideas and how sexuality and sex have been regulated by public policy and laws, and on the other hand, how public policy and laws have shaped how we feel about and how we see sex and sexualities. So all of these talks have focused on a different area, and tonight we're really pleased to have Dr. Gary Kinsman. And I'd just like to invite Chris Stover, who's the General Manager of CCEPA, to come up and say a few words.
Good evening, everyone. As Elizabeth mentioned, I'm Chris Stover, and I'm the General Manager of the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs. CCEPA is a joint venture of the Atlantic School of Theology and St. Mary's University. It provides an arena for critical thinking, public discussion, and research into current ethical challenges in our society. We're here tonight to present, in collaboration with a fine team of people here at the Mount, Part 3 of our series, In Sex and the Citizen. And I'd like to welcome you and thank you for coming out on behalf of our board and our executive director, Dr. Sheila Brown. Tonight's presentation is part of a 4-part lecture series designed to examine sex law, sex education, the sex trade, and sex in public policy. Part 1 of the series, entitled Reinventing the Sexual Contract, Ethical Questions about Sex, Marriage, and Autonomy, can now be viewed on the CCEPA website. And Part 2, Sex Goes to Market, will be loaded to that same page in coming days. Following tonight's presentation, we'll be back in this room one more time to discuss children's sexuality. So on March 2nd, Judith Levine, author of Harmful to Minors, The Perils of Protecting Children from Sex, will address the question of, what are we afraid of? Please have a look at the display table outside the auditorium for more information about the series and the other work the groups here are involved in. There's a sign-up sheet if you'd like to be notified of the other events that we host. And as well, there's a sampling of our presentations on DVD that you're welcome to take home with you if they pique your interest. Also note evaluations on the chair next to you or a chair nearby. It's quite helpful for us to know how our presentations are received. So we'd really be grateful if you could take a minute and fill that out during or at the conclusion. Thanks very much.
So tonight, as I said, Dr. Kinsman will be speaking, and then we're really happy to have Dr. Elaine Craig be our discussant. Dr. Craig is our discussant for all 4 parts of this series. She's a professor in the Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie University and has written extensively on the area of queer legal theory, feminist legal theory, and the criminal regulation of sex work. After the talk, there'll be an opportunity for questions, and Dr. Marnina Gonick, who's our Canada Research Chair in Gender Studies, will be moderating that. And after that, you're all invited next door to a reception where Dr. Kinsman's books will be on sale at a publisher's discount tonight. So we're really delighted that Dr. Kinsman agreed to be a speaker in our series because his research really exemplifies the kinds of questions we're looking at. Dr. Kinsman is a professor of sociology at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario. He is one of Canada's leading academics on lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender issues. His text, Regulation of Desire, which he published in 1987, is one of the key Canadian texts on LGBT social history and has been used in universities across Canada. People in this room may have actually studied it in one of their courses. He's also a social activist. He helped found GLARE, Gays and Lesbians Against the Right Everywhere, and was one of the organizers of the first Pride event in Sudbury in 1987. His new book, published in 2010 and written with Patrizia Gentili, I got that right? The Canadian War on Queers, National Security as Sexual Regulation, has received considerable media and critical attention. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kinsman.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be doing this talk in Halifax today. As some of you might know, I lived in Nova Scotia for 2.5, 3 years, in the early 1990s, and it's really good to be back here speaking at the Mount. I'd like to thank the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs and Mount St. Vincent University for bringing me here. Now, I wanted to start off with a couple of descriptions of terms. Is there too much feedback? Am I being too loud? Turn off which one? This one? That's off, I think, so, okay. So hopefully that'll be better if I'm either too soft, too loud, although I've been known as a human megaphone, so I suspect I won't be too soft. But if I'm too loud, please let me know. So I just wanted to make some qualifying comments about a couple of terms I'm using on this first slide. So I'm drawing upon research that's been done by myself and Patrizia Gentile in a book called The Canadian War on Queers, National Security as Sexual Regulation, which I believe you can, if you're interested, you can purchase after this talk. I wanted to talk about a couple of terms used in the title of that book, first of all, and then actually talk about the relationship between sex and national security. The first term I wanted to talk about was Canadian. I think it's really important for all of us to recognize and to sort of trouble and problematize the word Canadian, to understand that from the very beginning of the colonial settler projects that eventually became Canada, that Indigenous people were actually defined as a risk to that project of national security, and to also recognize that we are on the historic territories of various Indigenous nations. I live in Sudbury. I'm actually on the land and territory of the Atikamekw and Anishinaabe people. So I think that's a really important statement to start off with. We need to always sort of trouble and problematize the notion of Canada to paint into the picture the struggles and the histories of Indigenous people. Now, I also wanted to talk for a moment about how I use the word queer. I do not use the word queer in the same way that a queer basher might use it, as I've heard said on a number of occasions before. I've actually been bashed throughout my life. I actually use the word queer to try to reclaim that term of abuse, to neutralize it, and to actually turn it against those people who would want to use it to oppress us. I also use it in a broader sense than just what can sometimes sound like clinical words like homosexual, lesbian, or gay, to try to get at a broader diversity of forms of gender and sexual expression that exist in rupture with institutionalized heterosexuality and the two-gender binary system. And finally, I use the word queer to define a place from which we can actually raise questions about various social institutions that are considered normal in our society, in the way that queer theory talks about the need to queer various aspects of the social world around us. So part of what I'm doing in this talk is actually queering the notion of national security. The final thing I wanted to talk about was just the relationship between sex and national security. And I wanted to talk about sex and nations to begin with. Oftentimes, we don't really think about how the formation of nation states is also bound up with the particular construction and production of sexualities in particular forms. So that oftentimes the notion of a nation, and of course national security, is based on expelling certain types of sexualities from the framework of the nation and from the framework of national security. But the other side of that is everywhere and always certain types of sexualities are constructed in the center of society as being the normal sexuality, the national sexuality, the secure sexuality, the safe sexuality. And I think that's a very important starting place for us in terms of talking about sex and national security. So let's see if the technology will work. Okay, so I'm not going to be talking to you in particular about the Gerda Munsinger affair, if anyone knows anything about that. Gerda Munsinger developed a relationship with a conservative minister of defense in the Canadian government in the 1970s. She was alleged, at least, to have ties with Soviet intelligence. And as a result of this, there was an inquiry in the 1960s into this as a possible national security risk. So one way in which sexual danger was constructed in relationship to national security was to construct women who were prostitutes or women who were mistresses as somehow being a potential risk to national security because they allowed for government ministers or people who might have access to national security information to be compromised or possibly blackmailed. Now, even though that was an actual situation of the possible transfer of security information. It's really not what the RCMP and the Canadian security regime focused on in terms of sex and national security. Much more important to them from 1958 on was their construction of lesbians and gay men, of homosexuals, as they would have referred to us, as being a major risk to national security. And it's important to understand that those national security campaigns, although they started in an intense way in Canada in 1958, continued on into the 1990s and still continue to this day in some important ways. It is still quite possible for CSIS to deny someone a security clearance and therefore an employment possibility if they're considered to have something to hide. Not being out can actually be still constructed as a reason for denying someone a security clearance. So it's not as if the national security campaigns against queers are entirely over. But clearly from 58 through to the 1990s, in various different waves, there was a major campaign organized against lesbians and gay men, against queer people in the Canadian context. The basis for this campaign was that we supposedly suffered from a character weakness that made us vulnerable to blackmail by evil Soviet agents. I'm trying to put this forward in a somewhat sarcastic way, because there is absolutely no evidence in the Canadian context that any national security information was ever transmitted to agents of the Soviet Union or the Eastern Bloc on the basis of someone being compromised or blackmailed because they were lesbian or gay. Of the people we talked to, and a major source of our research for developing the Canadian War on Queers was talking to people who were directly affected, who were purged during this campaign, who experienced the national security campaigns in very direct and intimate ways. They all told us that the only people who ever tried to blackmail them was the RCMP itself, who tried to get them to give the names of their lesbian and gay friends to the RCMP so they could also investigate them. But just to talk about the stakes of this campaign, thousands and thousands of people were put under surveillance by the RCMP during the national security campaigns against lesbians and gay men, and later on this has continued when CSIS is formed in the 1980s. People were followed, people's places were broken into, people's phones were wiretapped, people were visited at work by RCMP officers, people were interrogated over a period of years. Obviously, lots of people lost their jobs, they were purged from promising careers, lives were destroyed, people killed themselves as a result of this campaign, people left the country, people fled Ottawa, in the early 1960s because of this national security campaign. This had a devastating impact on lots of people's lives. And of course, there's also the major campaigns that took place in the military that oftentimes tended to focus on lesbians, and we'll talk a little bit more about that a bit later on. To this day, the Canadian state has not apologized for these campaigns. And to this day, there's been no general compensation offered to people who were directly affected by these national security campaigns. Michelle Douglas and a few other people in the military who challenged the exclusionary policy in the early 1990s did receive some compensation for the wrongdoing that was done to them. But up until this point in time, the Canadian state has not recognized the havoc and devastation that they caused in many people's lives. Now, this is basically the first cross-country demonstration ever held in Canada in August 1971 on Parliament Hill, and of course it was raining. And I want to make a couple of observations around this historical photo. First of all, this was an event that was put under the surveillance of the RCMP. So the RCMP was watching this event. It was organized by a group called Toronto Gay Action, and you can see their banner there. The reason why the RCMP had this event under surveillance was that some left-wing activists in a group called the League for Socialist Action and the Young Socialists were members of Toronto Gay Action. That's how the RCMP found out about it. They then decided that they would put the gay movement more generally under surveillance. And it's important to understand that at its origin point, the gay liberation movement in the Canadian context was part of a much broader composition of left struggle, even though there were lots of criticisms that people were making of homophobia and heterosexism on the left as well. I also like this slide because of their sort of sending up of sort of the heterosexual character of the Canadian nation state. So Canada, True North, Strong and Gay, is definitely an attempt to sort of queer, in a certain sense, the heterosexual character of the Canadian nation state, to sort of trouble the heterosexual character of the Canadian nation state. This demonstration was held in 1971 on the second anniversary of the proclamation of the 1969 Criminal Code Reform. Now, the 1969 Criminal Code Reform, in a mythological way, is supposedly when homosexual acts were legalized in Canada. That never took place at that point in time. What you did have happen was a decriminalization of certain homosexual-related activities. You had a shift from a total criminalization perspective you could identify with a sort of moral conservative strategy of sexual regulation towards what could be more properly described as a liberal strategy of sexual regulation. The liberal strategy of sexual regulation based on the 1950s Wolfenden report from England was that you were to regulate sexuality on the basis of whether it was in public or in private, and whether it involved adults or whether it involved young people. So all that the 1969 Criminal Code Reform did was to actually partially decriminalize some homosexual activities if they were engaged in private, basically behind closed bedroom doors, and only if they involved two consenting adults, that is, two individuals who were the age 21 or over. It's important to point out, like in many other countries where the Wolfenden-type reforms were implemented, the actual convictions for homosexual-related sexual offenses explode after the 1969 Criminal Code Reform. There's actually an escalation of sexual policing, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Now, the best stuff, or the sort of heart of the Canadian War on Queers, is actually first-hand accounts from people who were directly affected by the national security campaigns. And I'm going to be reading some of them to you, and I'm going to be trying to put a particular emphasis on some of the accounts that come from Nova Scotia and Halifax. This first one, though, doesn't. But one of the things that happened in terms of the surveillance of lesbians and gay men was interrogations. And this is Harold, who was purged from the Navy in the late 1950s on the West Coast, talking about some of his experiences. And he was interrogated by both naval intelligence and by the RCMP. This particular agency, the RCMP, does not operate with kid gloves. It is true that to state the terms used by these agents were mildly expressed, forceful, but the method of attack was decidedly clever. I was told that persons of my caliber are so much easier to handle than drugstore cowboys. To my inquiry, why, the answer was that I was an individual of responsibility, integrity, and background, as could readily understand the terrible import of the question, and this is the most important part of this quote. Which is the greater treason? Treason to your country or treason to your friends? And he goes on to report that all the RCMP wanted was that I should talk, give names, and suspicions. It's important to look at the counterposition that's being put forward here. Loyalty on the part of Harold to his gay friends was disloyalty to the Canadian state, right? You had to be disloyal to your friends if you actually wanted to be loyal to Canadian national security in this particular situation. And Harold experienced the RCMP and military intelligence as trying to blackmail him to give the names of his gay acquaintances. Now, this is an account that comes from Frank Letourneau, that's his real name, who lives in Halifax. He's away right now, otherwise he'd be here. And he's describing himself being purged from the Navy in Halifax in 1970. And this is some of what he has to say. The ship's second in command asked me to come to his cabin and informed me that the military police wanted to see me the next day. When I asked why, he told me that I was suspected of being homosexual and that he and the ship's captain had been made aware of this, jumping over a line. The next day, we drove up together to the military police office at Seton, and I was interviewed by relatively junior non-commissioned personnel. My executive officer offered to stay, but I told him that I'd be all right. Actually, I was anything but all right, as my interrogators began to flip through a thick binder containing pictures of my car in known cruising areas, details of my comings and goings, people I had befriended on board ship, etc. The main focus of the questions seemed to be to incite me to give them other names of serving gay personnel I had associated with. Peaches Latour was a French-Canadian drag performer and hairstylist living in Ottawa, and he was interrogated by the RCMP in the later 1960s. And this is what he reports when an RCMP officer called him in. He said it was my civic duty to tell on them, that is, on other gays. And I mean, being French-Canadian and not well educated, I didn't have a clue what he meant. I said, well, explain it to me. Well, he said, it would be on your shoulders that some gay acquaintance would be a traitor to Canada. I said, a traitor? All I do is shows. And Peaches Latour also told us really remarkable stories of how hairdressers led the way in terms of opening up space for gay men in Ottawa and across the country, and also about the class war that existed within gay networks between overts and coverts. Those are people who were out, who were largely working class in character, and those people who were coverts, who were in the closet or living a double life, who often were employed by government agencies. And the National Security Campaign obviously intensified this type of tension within queer communities. Now, another person who experienced major problems with the military was Dharwad, who was purged from the Canadian military in Halifax in the late 1970s. Later on, she wrote about her experiences, mostly in the third person. She was interviewed by a number of male SIU officers, Security Investigation Unit officers of the military. And I think paying some attention to the types of questioning and interrogation she got is of some importance, especially when we're looking at sex and sexual practices in relationship to national security. They asked her, when did you first know you were a lesbian? They want to know. Two men interrogating her about her sex life. What are they saying? Can they ask questions like that? They do over and over. She desperately needs to challenge their right to do this, but doesn't. Intimidated. Look, what do you want from me? I've already told you that I'm gay. It's not enough. They want details. When, where, even how. Tribadism, digital manipulation, on, repeating the same questions over and over until she wants to scream. Are you sure Sergeant Adams is the first woman you ever made love to? Yes. Is she the only woman in the services you've been involved with? Yes, the only one. Of course, I need to change the slide there. Yes, the only one. I've already told you that a dozen times. They change the direction of their questioning abruptly. Do you know what cunnilingus is? Yes, she says. I know what it means. Did you perform it on her? Yes, no, I don't know. Did she do it to you? This is degrading. She refuses to answer. Make them just leave me alone. She contemplates asking them if they are enjoying their sport. Do they get their rocks off on it? Why are they harassing me, and why am I complying? She raises her eyes to them slowly. Are they serious? They are. She can't help herself. She bursts into a tense laugh, not into tears. She's gradually becoming aware of the insanity of the situation. Shocked into regaining a sense of perspective, she tells them point blank, I'm not going to answer any more personal questions. Now, Dharwad has many more experiences, and people might want to look at some of her writings. She's one of the people who's never been given any apology, no compensation from the Canadian government. One of the things you see happening in this interview is the focus, especially in military interrogations, by the 1970s and into the 1980s, of sexual practice questions. One of the things that they now began to believe was sort of definitive evidence of lesbianism or homosexuality was when people could actually talk about the sexual practices and activities that they engaged in. And this was seen as really important, sort of clinching evidence of homosexuality. And this became a major focus, especially in military interrogations. The final story I want to relay just for this section comes from Andrew, who was a civilian employee of the Department of National Defense. He lived in Ottawa, was a member of Gays of Ottawa, and this comes from the early 1980s. This is what he reports. They did ask me a question, which was that if I ever had to choose, if there was ever a time when Gays of Ottawa would develop some sort of policy or some sort of protest or strategy against national defense, if it went on a rampage against them sort of thing, what would I do? Would I choose my gay politics, or would I choose my allegiance to national defense? Again, you see here the same counterposition. Are you going to be loyal to your queer friends, and this time a gay organization, or are you going to be loyal to the Canadian state and national defense? Now that helps to set the stage for some of the major features of the national security campaigns against queers. But there's another aspect of it that I want to at least spend a few moments on, which is the involvement of university-based researchers in this national security campaign, which raises significant questions for all of us in universities about how universities have actually been able to be used to conduct forms of research that have actually been able to be used to interrogate people, to purge people from their jobs in government employment. Frank Robert Wake, whose picture you see there, worked at Carleton University. He was at one point the chair of the psychology department. He was a researcher that the government employed on a number of occasions, including in their major Royal Commission on sex-related issues in the 1950s, the Royal Commission on Criminal Sexual Psychopaths. In the 1960s, he was approached by the security panel to try to identify detection technology. How can we find out for sure if someone is definitively lesbian or gay, right? So we can purge them from their positions or refuse to hire them in the first place. Now, Wake called this the special project. It got the label fruit machine because, of course, the normal control group was going to be RCMP officers. And they were dreadfully afraid that even though they were enrolled in the research as the normal control group, they would be found out to be fruits, right? So this was where the sort of appellation fruit machine came from. It was not actually what the government or Professor Wake referred to it as. The central feature of the fruit machine was what can be referred to as pupillary response tests, right? So they would show people images of half-naked, sometimes semi-nude, men's and women's bodies while they were taking photographs of the pupil of your eye to see whether it dilated or not, right? And the theory was this would be a scientific way, an objective way of being able to determine whether someone was lesbian or gay or not. Of course, it never did work. But it's important to point out that from 63 till about 68, the Canadian government, including Health and Welfare Canada, spent tens of thousands of dollars trying to develop this detection technology. So, I mean, that's, in some ways, it sort of seems comic, right, for us looking back on it now. But it's also an incredibly significant part of the national security campaign, which in some ways relied on psychiatric and psychological knowledge as a scientific basis to try to determine who was lesbian or gay and who wasn't. Now, I don't know if you can see this very well in this slide. This actually is one of the documents that was released under the Access to Information program. This is part of the battery of tests that were part of the fruit machine. This is the homosexual sort of word association list. So you would be given something that would actually test whether you were perspiring or showing signs of nervous anxiety, and then these words would be read to you, right, to sort of see how you would respond. So please, as I'm reading these homosexual coded words, in case there's people from RCMP, the RCMP or CSIS in the room, please do not display any sort of nervous, anxious responses. But and they had some knowledge of the cultural slang of gay and lesbian networks at the time. So some of the homosexual coded words that they would read to people were queen, circus, imagine that, gay, imagine that, bagpipe, bell, hole, blind, bull, camp, imagine that one, coup, cruise, drag, dyke. I mean, there's many other words here. I mean, it's also really interesting, the words that they have up here that are coded as being sort of normal, neutral, heterosexual words. So this was another part of the battery of tests that they used in the development of the fruit machine. Now, this is another one of the released documents. Wake did not believe that masculinity-femininity scales were a decisive indicator of who was lesbian or gay, but he thought they were sort of like a preliminary indicator. If people had sort of the wrong gendered responses to masculinity-femininity questions, that it might mean, you might have a queer person there, right? So just to read some of these to you, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with masculinity-femininity scales. So, just think about how you'd answer this question. I like mechanics magazines. I think I would like the work of a librarian. If I were a reporter, I would very much like to report news of the theater. I would like to be a nurse. I very much like hunting. I would like to be a soldier. I mean, these are the types of questions people would be asked. So that was another part of the battery of tests that was utilized in the development of the fruit machine. Now, when gay and lesbian organizations emerged in the 1970s, one of the things they challenged was the national security policies of the Canadian state, right? People were aware of the previous Purge campaign. They were aware of the problems people were having in the civil service and in the military. So the lesbian and gay movements challenged those policies. Because of that, the lesbian and gay movements themselves became a target of RCMP surveillance throughout the 70s and early 1980s. This is a demonstration on Parliament Hill in 1975, which was part of the National Lesbian and Gay Conference at that point in time. And you see these uniformed RCMP officers looking on. There were also ununiformed RCMP officers doing surveillance work at that time. Just to have the historical presence of another figure here, you actually see a protest here organized by Gays of Ottawa on November 7th, 1975, and this is Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who happens to wander into the midst of this particular demonstration. Now, at first, all gay and lesbian organizations are put under surveillance by the RCMP, including lesbian and gay dances, which apparently in the early 1970s were in and of themselves risks to national security. But by about 75, 76, the RCMP is beginning to realize that some of the sort of more liberal, social service-oriented lesbian and gay groups are not really that much of a risk. So they begin to develop a way of trying to differentiate between different gay and lesbian organizations. And one concept they use is the notion of gay political activists. Now, gay political activists for them are coded with three major characteristics. They're young. These are people who are interested in demonstrations and being public about being gay. And these are also people who have some connections to the left in a very broad-ranging way. So the RCMP tries to figure out which of the lesbian and gay groups that they encounter are actually controlled by these gay political activists. So they don't have to pay as much attention to the other gay and lesbian organizations. And I'll just jump down to the bottom of this slide. In one RCMP assessment report on the Gay Alliance Towards Equality in Vancouver, there is even an argument produced by the RCMP officers for the creation of a new liberal gay group in Vancouver, which could cut across the influence of the gay political activist Gay Alliance Towards Equality. So you begin to see some of the criteria that they were using to do their surveillance work. And they also had infiltrators within gay and lesbian organizations during this period of time as well. Now, this is a demonstration in Toronto. There's the lesbian contingent at the front of it in the late 70s against Anita Bryant. And if people don't remember who Anita Bryant is, she was sort of like the front person for many of the moral conservative right-wing campaigns against lesbians and gay men, especially in the later 1970s. This was the demonstration when she actually came to Toronto and appeared at People's Church in North York, but it was the demonstration that was held the day before. Now, even though the gay movement initially proclaimed its opposition to sexism and its solidarity with feminism and its support for lesbians, many lesbians did not experience gay men as being free of sexism. So many lesbians, after years of trying to work with gay men, actually separated from the gay movement, but they also experienced lots of heterosexism from heterosexual feminists. So many lesbians actually formed their own autonomous lesbian feminist movement. It also came under the surveillance of the RCMP, as this demonstration organized against Anita Bryant actually came under the surveillance of the RCMP. Interestingly enough, in the document we got released, the RCMP, even though lots of the page is blotted out, the surveillance reports on the organization of the demonstrations against Anita Bryant and the first International Women's Day demonstration organized in Toronto in 1978 are actually on the same page, right? So it's the same people who are actually undertaking this surveillance. Now, one of the currents within the feminist movement that came under the surveillance of the RCMP was wages for housework. Wages for housework was a particular current and campaign within the feminist movement that argued that women's unpaid domestic and reproductive labor actually produced the commodity labor power for capital. And therefore, women actually needed to get a wage for this type of unpaid labor. They were directly doing work for capital, but they were actually being denied a wage. And this was a current in the feminist movement that tried to organize around this question. They came under surveillance from the RCMP and the security panel because they were part of an international current that set off sort of red flags. They were Marxist feminists in sort of political inclination, and they also included, surprise, surprise, radical lesbians in their ranks. Now, we were able to access one report on wages for housework and the autonomous lesbian current within wages for housework called Wages Do Lesbians. And the RCMP account of this clearly gives us a sense of the sort of sexist, heterosexist, and anti-working class perspective that the RCMP took up during these years. And I'll read you a couple of quotes. Toronto Wages for Housework campaign's membership has been described by blanked out. This is one of the irritating things about the Access to Information program, that when you really want to know the information, they blank it out. If anyone's ever made an ATIP request, I would encourage you to make as many ATIP requests as possible to as many different agencies as possible, because you'll eventually find that some ATIP officers will blank out some information and other ones won't, and you'll be able to begin to piece it together. That's actually a clue that comes from Steve Hewitt's work on the national security campaigns and the RCMP surveillance of student organizing across Canada. So Wages for Housework was described as being born losers who in appearance and attitude are both lower working class and welfare cases and involved in living alternative lifestyles. Okay? Then they go on to say, this is especially true of the radical lesbians in Wages Do, who take a perverse pride, think about those words for a moment, a perverse pride in defeminizing themselves by cultivating the dirty and unkempt appearance. Now, what this means is the RCMP officers, and remember until the early 1970s, there was only male RCMP officers. There were some clerical workers who were women. So doing femininity differently, the way in which lesbians might do femininity was constructed as intentionally defeminizing themselves. It almost seems as if proper femininity was central to the defense of national security, and somehow women who weren't producing themselves as being properly feminine were a risk to national security. And this is common in the RCMP surveillance of feminist organizing as well. If you look at Christabel Sethna and Steve Hewitt's very interesting work on the RCMP surveillance of the abortion caravan in the early 1970s, you also see this incredible fixation by the RCMP on what women are wearing and how they're not wearing properly feminine clothing. Now, coming out of the experiences of people who were directly affected by the national security campaigns, you have not only sort of the notions of hegemonic common sense, which Antonio Gramsci talks about. You also have amazing moments of what Gramsci would have talked about as good sense, the good sense that arises out of experiences of oppression and marginalization. And this is a really important quote from Harold. Again, to remind you, Harold was purged from the Navy in the late 1950s. In the early 1960s, he wrote the following: "Security is a sacred cow of a word, in the name of which highly dictatorial and sweeping actions are possible, for which no explanation can be forced." What we see here is that Harold's actually putting in question the very practice of national security, which is something that I'd like to also do during this presentation tonight. Now, this is sort of an interlude in this presentation. So if you can think of the soundtrack, it's just changed, okay? Now, I can't actually produce this for you because of my musical incompetence. But for instance, if you associate theory with Annie DeFranco or classical music, have that playing in the background. If you associate theory with Rage Against the Machine or The Clash, have that sort of playing in the background. This is sort of a theoretical interlude on some of the things we learned from doing this historical investigation. David McNally points out, using the work of cultural critic and theorist Walter Benjamin, that rather than something laid down once and for all, the past is a site of struggle in the present. So when we were doing the research on the Canadian War on Queers, we were not only concerned about the historical past. Obviously, we were very concerned about constructing a different type of narrative of the historical past within the Canadian state. but we were also very concerned about the historical present. What does this tell us? What skills and capacities does this make visible for us about how we can deal with some of the contemporary struggles and problems that we're facing? And one of the most important theoretical conclusions we came to was that in some major ways, how ruling takes place in our society is through what we describe as the systematic social organization of forgetting. We don't have the historical social literacy to remember or feel the struggles of people in the past. We therefore, in some ways, are historically illiterate. So for instance, when they want to cut back social programs, which of course they're doing all over the place, we don't remember, we don't feel, we don't hear the major struggles that people have engaged in the past to win those social programs. It becomes then much easier because of the social organization of forgetting for various governments to just hack apart the social programs that were won through people's struggles in the past. Similarly, in relationship to national security, we don't remember all of the injustices and crimes that have been conducted in the name of national security in the Canadian context. For us, there's a really important antidote to the social organization of forgetting, which we hope the Canadian War on Queers book is part of, which is the resistance of remembering, telling the stories that they don't want us to hear about, remembering the struggles that people engaged in and the victories that people have engaged in the past. And this is very important for us in the context of the mainstream lesbian and gay movements right now, which in some ways implicitly have defined the winning of same-sex marriage as sort of the end game of our struggle. It's not the end game of our struggle, but it's also in some ways about the forgetting of the radical roots of our movement. And here by saying radical, what I mean is getting to the root of the problem, which is really what the term radical is all about. So radical in that sense is actually a really good term. One of the things, for instance, that I think we don't pay enough attention to is because we focus so much on adult rights and adult concerns in terms of limited notions of lesbians and gay rights, is that we are not paying enough attention to the continuing heterosexual regimes of terror that many young queer people have to continue to experience in high schools and on city streets. And if people want to, maybe we can come back to that in the discussion. It's been quite perplexing for me and Patricia that some lesbians and gay men have actually been able to be deployed in support of national security and are forgetting the sort of historical lessons of how national security is everywhere and always about excluding some people from the fabric of the nation, expelling some people, like queer people, for a historical period of time, from the fabric of the Canadian state. We always need to ask whose national security is being defended, who's being excluded, who is being included. And to also remember that the other side of the construction of the Canadian War on Queers was the construction of heterosexual hegemony, as we would describe it, in the Canadian context. The national security campaigns played a direct part in constructing the social relations of the closet and the social relations of living a double life in the Canadian context, and enshrined heterosexuality at the center of the Canadian state. This is just going to be really brief in terms of headlines. These are some of the inspirations that we draw upon in the Canadian War on Queers. The history from below approach developed by E.P. Thompson, which we extend to historical work for lesbians and gay men and queer people. Autonomous notions of Marxism that focus not on giving all power to capital and making workers out to be simply victims of capitalism, but instead the activity and resistance of workers, which we try to extend to the resistance of oppressed people, including queer people. The work of Dorothy Smith, especially her work in the development of sociology for women and for the oppressed, her critical analysis of ideology and ruling texts, and especially what we draw upon in the Canadian War on Queers is institutional ethnography, which takes the skills and capacities of ethnography developed in sociology and anthropology and turns them as weapons against ruling social institutions in our very own society. We also draw upon some of the insights of Michel Foucault in queer theory, but we're interested in trying to give those insights much more of a historical and materialist grounding. We also are engaged with a continuous dialogue with Marxism and historical materialism and trying to see how historical materialism can be used for queer people, which is at the very same time also a queering of historical materialism. And now to the very best stuff. One of the things that surprised us in our research was that we discovered that rather than lesbians and gay men simply lying down and taking it or running for cover, is that people refused to cooperate and people fought back. So this is an account from Sue. Sue was living in Halifax and was involved in the militia in the 1960s. And this is just some of what she has to say. And Sue's stories are delightful and funny. And we were just dyking it up. I used to walk down the street in Halifax and we used to holler, "Hey, you bull dyke!" Sue recounts a conversation she had with her father after joining the militia when he warned her of the dangers that lurked in certain barracks. My father, who had been in the military himself, was a sergeant, and he said to me, "Now listen, when you go away to summer camp," he said, "I want you to know that there are lesbians up there." I said, "Really, Dad?" He said, "Yes, and I want you to be careful. They're in huts H and J." I said, "H and J, Dad?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Okay, I'll be careful." I go in to check in. Of course, one of my lesbian buddies is on the desk. She says, "What huts do you want?" I said, "Either H or J would be just fine." And Sue goes on to talk about, and remember, this is in the militia, not the military proper, okay? Less regulation is exerted here. The deal was that you were supposed to go out with men. Oh, of course, I need to also change that for you. The deal was that you were supposed to go out with men. So what we did was at military camp, we went out with the men in the early part of the evening, and then because we were very virtuous young women, we said, "Oh, we have to go home early." And the military, being very accommodating, said, "This is where the women sleep. This is where the men sleep." We said, "Fine, that's cool, we'll go back with the women." Back we go with the women. What we used to do, we dykes, we would want to go out and party. And we would take our bunk beds and we would fill them with pillows. And then we would say to the heterosexual women, "We really want to meet Charlie." We would lie to them, and they would cover because they thought we were going out to meet men. We were going out to meet women. But we had it set up at the back of the barracks and took over this room. We barricaded it from one side, and then we had women on the other side guarding it because that's where we were with Charlie. But they never saw Charlie. So here we had all these straight women guarding us and guarding our beds and making sure that the authorities never knew we were out, and we weren't supposed to be. So we would be out with sergeants, staff sergeants, corporals, privates, lieutenants. No rank was untouched. So we would be running all over camp. And the deal was you weren't allowed to leave the premises. So, of course, we wanted wine, women, and song. So in order to get wine, women, and song, you had to leave the base. So you had to go out. But you weren't allowed to wear butchy clothing. You had to wear a dress. So what we used to do was we would pull our pant legs up and hide them with our skirt. And you'd go out and through the gates in your skirt, right, looking all femmy and lovely. Well, this one night we came home and we got a little too drunk. Well, trust me that the pants were down. And we were up on charges the next day for being in some place we weren't supposed to be, improper attire, all kinds of things. So we learned that we shouldn't drink too much. Now, I don't know how many of you know, I mean, if you've ever been on Barrington Street, you might recognize this particular building. It's the Turret. It was where the Turret was in the late 1970s. It was at 1588 Barrington Street, and in 1977, it was opened by the Gay Alliance for Equality as a sort of gay social center and club. Now, across the street from the Turret was the Green Lantern Building, which is where it was believed that the SIU, the Security Intelligence Unit of the military, was doing surveillance. Stefan Serard was purged from the military in 1981 because he was seen going into the Turret. Okay, that was the central piece of evidence that he was homosexual. That was used against him in his purge from the military. Now, Robin Metcalf, and I'll just use the word Anne from Apple, developed this song that they actually performed at the National Gay Conference in 1978. It was sung to the tune of Santa Claus is Coming to Town. Now, I'm going to actually try and sing it, but my voice is horrible, so if it's just too unbearable, just tell me to shut up, okay? Because I think it's probably better to sing it than to read it. You better watch out, you better be sly, you better keep out, I'm telling you why, the SIU is watching you now. They're making a list, they're checking it twice, they're going to find out who's naughty or nice, the SIU is watching you now. They know who you've been sleeping with, they know if you're of age, they know if you've been gay or straight, so be straight for goodness sake. You better watch out. You better be sly. You better keep out. I'm telling you why the SIU is watching you now. Anyway, I'm sorry about inflicting that song on you. By the way, that's my first singing attempt since I recorded a Beatles song when I was really, really young. So hopefully it wasn't that terrible, I hope anyway. There were more collective forms of resistance as well. This is David's story that we start the Canadian War on Queers book with, and it's really about turning the tables on the RCMP and the security police. So what he tells us is that in the Lord Elgin Tavern, which was a gay hangout in the early 1960s in Ottawa on Elgin Street, there would oftentimes be a police informant or a police operative, an RCMP operative, who would come into the bar, who would sit at a table, would try to isolate themselves from the other people on the table, would put a newspaper down in front of them, and people would eventually notice there was a hole cut in the newspaper, and that person was taking photos of everyone who was in the bar. And you might think, this is 1963 or 1964, no organized gay movement at all in Ottawa. People would just run out of the place, they'd jump out of the tables. And that's not at all what happened. Instead, people would get eye contact with each other, and people would pull out things like wallets, and they would sort of take mock pictures in a very campy way back at the RCMP operative. And what they were clearly doing was, first of all, exposing the RCMP operative to everyone in the room and making a very clear, sending a very clear message that this person was not welcome in that space. Now, that's pretty remarkable in 1964, but what you actually find in the RCMP documents themselves is that by 63, 64, the previous informant groups that they had that were actually giving the RCMP some names stopped doing it. What you begin to see, and this is clarified by talking to lesbians and gay men who were involved in the Ottawa scene at that point in time, is that there was sort of a community ethics that was developed. That was, if the RCMP approached you, you did not talk to them. Right? And if you did talk to them, you would be shunned by people in the community. And this is one of the central ways in which this non-cooperation was actually organized in relationship to the RCMP campaign. The RCMP was forced by this non-cooperation and resistance to shift its tactics. It's actually one of the reasons why the RCMP was interested in the fruit machine was because their previous informants were no longer giving them names. They thought this was a scientific way in which they wouldn't have to conduct costly field investigations anymore. The RCMP also started to rely more on local morality squads to put pressure on individuals and to say to them, we've caught you, we're going to lay a criminal charge against you unless you give us the names of all of your gay or lesbian friends, right? That was sort of the type of argument that was being used against people. Now, in the 1970s, obviously with the growth of the lesbian and gay movements, there's more capacity for resistance. The other thing that should be clear, though, is that in the 1970s, as queer community formation became more visible and more public, the empire also strikes back, to steal a line from a popular culture movie. That is, the more public visibility of queer sexualities and queer communities called the RCMP and the police, sex police, down on expanding forms of lesbian and gay community formation. This is a demonstration that was held in Montreal in June of 1976. People may not remember this, but prior to the 1976 Summer Olympics in Montreal, there was a major social cleansing campaign. And this time, it was not only against poor and homeless people, which is, of course, what took place around the time of the Winter Olympics in 2010 in Whistler and Vancouver. It was also specifically directed against lesbian and gay establishments and lesbian and gay communities. At one point in time in Montreal, all lesbian and gay establishments had been shut down by police activity. This demonstration was part of the beginning of the turning around of that situation. When more and more people came out and spoke out against it, when it became clear that the Olympic organizing actually had conscious decisions and perspectives about trying to cleanse Montreal and Ottawa of queer presences for the period of time of the Olympics, there began to be more opposition. Along with other types of campaigns against police activity, this is a photo from the resistance to the bath raids in Toronto in 1981. Along with these types of major movement and community mobilizations, some of the strategies of sexual policing began to be closed off to the police. And through the growth of our movements and communities and the allies we were able to win, we began to concretely undermine the national security campaigns, especially as more and more lesbians and gay men were out and visible and our communities grew. Some of the rationales of the national security campaigns began to crumble, although they didn't fully crumble on an official level in the military until 1992. The RCMP has developed new targets, and CSIS has developed new targets, and the security police have developed new targets. Obviously, throughout this whole history, there was a major national security mobilization against Indigenous people. But from 1997 on, with the APEC protests in Vancouver, through Quebec City, through to the protests against the G20 in Toronto last June, you've seen a major national security mobilization against global justice protesters. A lot of that has been organized quite clearly in relationship to national security and also in relationship to the defense of internationally protected persons who need to be protected over and against the democratic rights of people within Canada to be able to protest these particular activities. I should also point out, if you haven't heard about it, that lesbians and gay men who were arrested in the G20 protests in Toronto experienced incredible levels of homophobic and heterosexist harassment. They were put in separate cages from other people. Trans people in particular experienced incredible forms of harassment from the security police at that point in time. Part of what's going on here is that at the same time as global justice protesters, people who might want to challenge capitalism, are expelled from the fabric of the nation, the other side of that is sort of the implicit construction of a sort of pro-capitalist perspective as being at the heart of what Canada is supposed to be. Now, there's a whole other group of new targets who have been developed in relationship to the national security campaigns. These are all people who've been victimized by the national security certificate regime in the Immigration Act in the Canadian context. We thought that that had actually crumbled, but now with the recent upholding of the national security certificate against Mohammed Harkat, it looks like the national security certificates are being revived. Now, in the context of the so-called war on terror, what we again see is how national security operates. So Muslim and Arab-identified people living in Canada are expelled from the fabric of the nation, and sort of implicitly a sort of white Christian-derived culture or civilization is placed at the center of Canadian society. Like all major national security campaigns, there's a gender and sexual politics to the so-called war on terror. It is another war for masculinity and another war for heterosexuality with a new twist. Right? The new twist is this sort of Orientalist notion that Arab and Muslim people are supposedly backward, uniformly and unitarily backward when it comes to questions of sexuality and gender, when it comes to questions of lesbians and gays and women's rights, despite the incredible diversity around gender and sexual related questions among Arab and Muslim identified people. So they're identified as being backward. And we have the experience, and I'm sure some of you might have heard some of these individuals talking, moral conservatives who would never say a thing in defense of lesbian and gay rights or feminist rights in the Canadian context, being incredibly concerned about lesbian and gay rights and feminism in countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Palestine, but never here. And I think this is really something that we need to be quite critical of. The sort of last major point I want to make is what this has meant for those of us in the lesbian and gay movements and the queer movements who've been part of a global movement in solidarity with the Palestinian people, who've tried to develop a wing of the lesbian and gay movement, just like we did in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, that's also in solidarity with the Palestinian people. And I should point out that that project has two sides to it. Queers Against Israeli Apartheid in Toronto, for instance, which I'm connected with, is not only about building queer support for Palestinians. On the other side, it's also about queering the Palestinian struggle and establishing more space for queer people within the Palestinian struggle. But Queers Against Israeli Apartheid has been vilified and attacked, especially in Toronto, in other places as well, because it's concretely interfered with this Orientalist construction of all Arabs and Muslims as being backward around sexual and gender questions, and because it's concretely got in the way of attempts to rebrand Israel, in the Toronto context in particular, as being a queer-friendly or gay-friendly place. That's one of the reasons why you've seen incredible mobilizations in Toronto. This is a mobilization at the 519 Community Centre that you see up there at the top against the attempt to purge Queers Against Israeli Apartheid from the Pride events. And this is the Shame Award that was given by community groups to the Pride Committee for their attempt to do just that. For me, in some ways, Queers Against Israeli Apartheid, lesbians and gay men who are involved in groups like No One Is Illegal or anti-poverty activist groups are in some ways trying to return us to some of the radical roots of the queer liberation movement. And I wanted to just end off with some quotes from the very end of the Canadian War on Queers book. And this is a sort of the last section we call Agency and Resistance that Patrizia and I wrote. The queer resistance to the Canadian War on Queers, documented in this book, makes us optimistic that a better world is possible. In the 1960s, restrained by national security, social surveillance, stigmatization, and heterosexism, queer people were able to talk back to and make fun of the security police. In the late 20th century, the public and visible actions of our movements and communities undermined the basis of the national security campaigns. By the late 1990s, we had put an end to the main aspects of these campaigns against us, even though national security remains a major problem for many queers, especially those who are people of color or those who are identified as being Arab or Muslim at this point in time. We are never simply victims or people without agency. We have the power to act, to do, and to create. We can subvert and undo national security and move towards a world in which there are no others, and in which we can appreciate and celebrate the differences between people. This is the world we need and desire. And finally, a bunch of thank yous to Patrizia Gentile, my co-author, to the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs and Mount St. Vincent University, to the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives for many of the historical photos that are used here, to my partner Patrick and our wonderful son Mike. And I can't end without having an image of people having fun, because I think quite central to all of the resistances of queer people is always that we have fun and we celebrate, and we need to carry that forward in our struggles today. Thank you very much.
First of all, let me just commend you, Gary, on this piece of work, and thank you for it. It is an insightful, rich, thought-provoking, thorough, and very important contribution to the literature in Canada on gay history, on social justice movements, and theories of power. I really, more than anything, just have questions for you, which I've tried to work into a response. And I'm actually going to, bear with me, but bring you back to the theoretical interlude a bit. So I guess put the Ani DeFranco back on. So as I engaged with your book and listened to you this evening, I found myself asking, so is the Canadian War on Queers over? And it seems to me that the answer to this must be both yes and no. And I think that to some extent, that depends on how we understand the term queer. So I was glad that you started actually with an exploration of what that term means. And I actually think that this distinction is central to your project. So do we refer to queer to mean people with same-sex desire, people who identify as gay and lesbian, or do we mean queer as in a positionality? Subverting or being outside of, or being constituted as outside of some hegemonic norm. So I think that whether the Canadian War on Queers is over depends on this definition. And arguably the state-sanctioned, perpetuated Canadian War on gays and lesbians, as manifested through the national security campaigns, as you point out, as a consequence of activism and subversive resistance, as well as, I think, a great deal of litigation and human rights movement, arguably the queer or the Canadian war on gays and lesbians might be over in that sense. As a consequence of all of these movements, formal equality has largely been achieved for gays and lesbians in Canada. But as you also point out, more so in your book than this evening, well, that's not fair. You did point it out fairly comprehensively tonight. The social ideologies and the practices continue to be used to construct targets for things like a national security campaign, to keep the national security machine, whether that be a fruit machine or a machine of another genre, operative. So the social processes, the regulation, the mechanisms of surveillance, the regulatory apparatus of the state, I suppose, that allowed people who deviated from particular sexual norms to be constituted as threats to society and enemies of the state, those processes and mechanisms remain in place. In other words, the social processes that successfully constituted even gays and lesbians, not just as a group of people with a secret, and thus susceptible to blackmail, but as a type of people. In particular, a category or type of people inclined to deception and weak character and communism remain operative. Communism, really? Your book brilliantly depicts, with the fruit machine and all the rest of it, how it's so ludicrous that it would be funny if it wasn't so grossly unjust and problematically oppressive. Anyway, it seems to me, and you make this point in your book, that the war on subversives, or the war on queers, can't end without significant social renovation. Social renovation that would require a dismantling of these mechanisms, a dismantling of these processes of surveillance, these regulatory norms, as well as a different social understanding of what national security and nationalism means. And so my sense, based on your work, is that the answer to my question is that, like I said, the Canadian war on gays and lesbians is over, the Canadian war on queers is not. Which leads me to ask another question. Assuming that the Canadian war on gays and lesbians is over, what has been achieved? Like I said, certainly formal equality for gays and lesbians has been achieved. But does equality for some sexual minorities mean, however, that they're not only accepted, recognized as citizens, full rights-bearing, equality, equal citizens, but also that they've become assimilated into these social mechanisms, these webs of power, you depict the biopower so well there with the questions about the cunnilingus and whatnot, that continue to operate by constituting these subjects through systems of inclusion and exclusion. In other words, with the acquisition of same-sex marriage, with pension benefits, with increasing economic and political power, the concern, I think, is that that gay and lesbian subjects now become part of this process. These processes that perpetuate models of othering, regulation, and surveillance. It's not just that as they become citizens, allies of the state, new enemies are constituted. The question is, what happens as the once queers become part of the state? What's the impact of homonormativity and homo-nationalism, to use Lisa Duggan's phrase? So how does gay, lesbian, GLBT activism, for example, contribute to the status of the still queers and the new queers in a world of homonormativity? What do we make of the assimilated once queers who guard their newfound status as respectable mainstream sexual minorities possessed of full citizenship, who guard it by engaging in censorship campaigns, who guard it by purges of organizations like Queers Against Israeli Apartheid. what do we make of them? And do they, in some sense, by doing this, support the modern national security campaigns and the othering of new queers, such as Arabs and Muslims, and the still queers, such as sex workers and trans folks and bulldykes and femi-fags. Membership has its benefits, but we must always ask, what are its costs to others? And I think you asked that question so well in your book. So, how do we think about networks of solidarity that transcend borders, both metaphorical and geographical? One of the important ways in which you examine this issue is the link between the historical treatment of gays and lesbians by the Canadian state and, like you say, the current so-called war on terror. So, the way in which the processes of othering continues through, like you said, Orientalism, the demonization of Middle Eastern masculinity, and the portrayal of Islamic sexuality. And the manner in which this has constituted these subjects, subjects that, inform the current national security campaign and its delineations between, whose security matters and whose does not. Have the gay political activists become, the Muslim extremists and the global justice activists. One example, that comes to mind for me when I think about this and what your work suggests is the Omar Khadr case. And the Supreme Court of Canada, of course, as everyone knows, found that, that Omar Khadr's right to life, liberty, and security of the person had been violated by Canadian officials, right? Canadian officials that had interrogated him at Guantanamo Bay, knowing that he had been subject to torture tactics, and then handed over the product of their interviews, of course, to the U.S. military. Despite finding that this violated his Section 7 rights, and despite finding that, despite later finding that his continued detainment for another 7 years and Canada's failure to do anything to seek extradition was actually a further violation of his rights, the court essentially refused to grant a remedy. In other words, they found there was a charter violation with respect to this terror suspect, but didn't require the government to do anything about it. A very foundational principle of law is that where there's a right, there must be a remedy. In the case of Omar Khadr, it seems that this has not been the case. And different commentators have suggested different explanations for why the court did this. Some have said that it reveals, the politicization of the court, or the refusal of this particular court, or perhaps this particular Chief Justice, to embark too far into the foray of public controversy. Or perhaps, it's an explicit example of the court failing to recognize this terror suspect as a fully rights-bearing citizen, much as, the Canadian military did with Frank Letourneau and Dharwad. I actually think it's maybe not so much that, at least that latter explanation. I actually think that it's more a reflection of our current political climate. I think that the court recognizes, given the current government's willingness to undermine processes of democracy and the Constitution, that had they ordered the government to seek extradition, had they ordered the government to remedy their charter rights violation, Prime Minister Harper likely wouldn't have done it, which would totally undermine the court's legitimacy as an institution of democracy. That this would cause a greater democratic deficit, that it would greatly weaken the normative force of our charter guarantees, that, if the court was to order a remedy and the government was to ignore it, they would lose their legitimacy. I think, if I'm right, if that hypothesis is correct, that they're being astute. We are in an era of a government that overtly disregards the Constitution for its own political survival. We are in an era of a government that insidiously undermines social programs social justice movements and equality rights by quietly cutting funding, like you suggested, by eliminating programs. We may de facto be in a problematic era in which there sometimes is a right without a remedy. In a sense, I think the Cotter case brings me back to where I started with my questions. I think the Charter, access to liberal rights regimes, the normative limits, the subversive potential of social justice movements. The cessation of the government's official discrimination towards gay and lesbians stopped at the same time that gay and lesbians began to successfully secure equality guarantees, to successfully secure human rights protection. The government lost the war on Canadian gays and lesbians during a very different charter era in a very different political climate. And I can't help but wonder whether for the still queers and the new queers, the situation isn't even more dire today.
Okay, it's my great pleasure to moderate the discussion, and I invite anybody who has questions to use the microphone in the aisle. So yes, go ahead.
So I guess I was thinking about a lot of things when I heard you speak, and I guess two of the things that I'm really interested in, one is the use of science and health to regulate queer identities, but I'm not going to ask a question on that now, but maybe I will at the reception. What I'm going to ask about is borders. And so like 5 or 6 years ago, I saw Leslie Feinberg speak about the danger of crossing borders as a trans person and of forging documentation. And then this past Christmas, I was in Toronto for visiting my family, and I watched as Daniel Garcia, a young boy, was deported because his sister had been quietly deported prior to his deportation back to Mexico because they had been denied a refugee claim based on the fact that they were in fear of their lives because Daniel's sister is a queer woman, and her partner had been, basically their family had threatened her life, and so they had come to Canada. They had tried to claim refugee status. Their refugee status claim had been denied, and then they had stayed, and then the sister was deported, and then it was discovered that.
Okay, so your question.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna get to it.
You're getting there. Okay,
I don't think
good.
there doesn't seem to be a big line behind me.
But so there are people who are signaling that they do have questions.
So I'm just, based on those kinds of two examples, one of borders regulating trans identity, and also of the issue of status. And I was just wondering if you could comment on how the contemporary situation relies on borders specifically to try and enforce, maintain a national or safe sexuality.
So, around the question of borders, I think borders is absolutely crucial for us to address in a whole bunch of different ways. One of the reasons why there was historically the campaign against lesbians and gay men was that we were seen as defying the proper boundaries or borders around sexuality and gender. I think your question's really important in terms of highlighting the significance of what's going on now in relationship to the policing of borders and the crossing of borders. And it's actually caused me some distress that sort of mainstream gay and lesbian organizing has not sort of seen what's happened to people of color in particular around borders as not being something we should take up. There's certainly been some focus on the sort of more explicit lesbian or gay questions that have been raised around borders, but obviously these are related to a much broader intensification of borders. To put it another way, central to what's going on right now in terms of neoliberalism and capitalist globalization is not a uniform weakening of the state, right? This is often the way in which neoliberalism is talked about. It's sort of like some sort of uniform weakening of the nation state. because neoliberalism operates not only through hacking apart social programs and destroying forms of social solidarity within nation states, it also operates quite centrally through the intensification of the disciplining of working class and poor people and the intensification of regulation at borders. Well, the world is made more free for capital to move around wherever it wants to. People are, especially poor and working class and people of color, are more fixed in terms of their locations. And we really need to understand the centrality of borders around not just sort of limited sexual and gender questions. I mean, it seems to me that there's an incredible amount to be learned from the No One is Illegal movement, which is basically arguing that if capital has the right to move wherever it wants to on this globe, everyone else should as well, right? Poor and working class people and people of color in particular. And obviously that will assist lesbians and gay men, and in the broader sense, queer people, our ability to move around the borders as well. We have to break down these notions of otherization that are constructed against immigrants who are coded as being people of color, the types of border restrictions that are mobilized around people who are identified as being Arab or Muslim. I have a student in my class at Laurentian University who is actually from Norway, but she's originally from a Somali background, and her name gives that away. She was actually stopped when she tried to come back to Canada after the winter holidays. She was actually stopped because she had an Islamic-sounding name, and they prevented her from actually going on her flight. She then had to actually come up with the money in Miami on her own to be able to book another flight. Of course, she missed basically a week of school as a result of this. So there's ways in which we really need to pay much more attention to this. I'm not sure I'm fully able to address your questions. It's also about how defying boundaries, defying borders is central to what we could articulate as queer projects, and we have to begin to understand that those boundary transgressions, those border transgressions, don't just take place explicitly in a narrow way in relationship to sexuality. They take place in a number of other contexts that we need to pay attention to. And obviously trans people live those types of border transgressions in really important ways, and it's of some distress to me that the mainstream gay and lesbian movements might be willing to argue for sort of formal rights for trans people, but doesn't want to take on board the sort of more radical implications of trans politics in terms of problematizing gender, seeing that our struggle is also against the two-gender binary system in our society. So hopefully my ranting has addressed some of your concerns.
Okay. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wondered, oftentimes when doing exploration of what the Mounties are doing in terms of, it seems very clumsy, Keystone Cops, and I'm just wondering if it is totally incompetent, or if part of the message is they don't care if they're known, if their explorations and their investigations are known, because part of their agenda is to browbeat that whatever community happens to be the target. And I'm just wondering whether, because when they're out, they still keep on when they're known to be doing things, they still keep on doing it. And my second question is whether there's any, I mean, the Queers Against Apartheid in Israel was good in terms of indicating a community who has gone through this kind of attack, are they less likely to become involved in solidarity with other groups, or are they more likely to say, look, we've done our turn in the limelight, I'm happy that it's you now getting the grief, not happy, but I'm relieved it's you and not me. I'm just wondering if it's possible to generalize on those areas. Thanks.
I'll try to be really quick because I'm really interested in hearing what more people have to say. I think there's certainly moments when the RCMP and CSIS are totally grossly incompetent. In the 1970s, I mean, one of the things you have to understand is that with both the RCMP and CSIS, they're explicitly allowed to engage in illegal activity, right? That's what national security allows them to do. They can break the law and not have to pay any consequences for it. If you set up a situation like that, eventually some people are going to learn about it, right? Which is what happened in the 1970s with the RCMP. I mean, the Canadian government did not want to produce a different national security service, right? It was forced to because the RCMP basically lost all credibility after stealing, membership lists of associated with the Parti Québécois, after burning down barns, after planting bombs and trying to blame them on the FLQ. When those things leaked out, they certainly produced a legitimacy crisis, and the government, as its standard response, set up a commission of inquiry, the MacDonald Commission, give it limited terms of reference, and then pull out of the hat CSIS as sort of like the new improved national security force, which of course has produced many of the same problems. But I do think we have to be aware that they're quite competent. Right? I'll just give you one example. Around the G20 and their surveillance and infiltration of activist groups, they implanted people in collective households in Guelph and in Kitchener-Waterloo 2 years in advance of the G20. And I mean, that's where many of the people who were preventatively arrested that morning, it's based entirely on the evidence of these people who lived in activist houses, who wrote down things people said at the breakfast table, right? And that's being used as evidence against these particular individuals. So there's also incredible levels of calculation and incredible levels of planning. But things mess up, right? I mean, the security forces at the G20 for 5 hours, the central office in Barrie, where they were trying to coordinate all of this, lost contact with what people were doing on the ground in Toronto, right? That's now been established, right? So there's contradictions, but I think we should be clear that I think they're pretty competent. We need to actually recognize that even if they sometimes look really stupid and ludicrous, that they can actually be a real major threat, and we need to organize against them. I mean, one of the campaigns that I'm supporting, which comes out of the national, the Popular Commission on the National Security Certificates, is a policy of non-collaboration with CSIS, right? I mean, they come in and they say, we just want some information, but they actually can draw people in to providing information to them that is actually quite detrimental to other people. In terms of QIA, I wasn't fully sure about the question, but my sense was that are the people who are now mobilizing around queer support for Palestinian struggles, is that all they are interested in, or is that connected to other stuff? And I think for most of the people involved in a group like QIA, they're quite concerned about other social justice issues. But if you look at sort of the mainstream response and how the Pride Committee leadership in Toronto responded, and by the way, this has not been the same across the country, right? You have to understand there's a particular reason why organizing in Toronto around this issue, because of the concrete strategy on the part of the Israeli state to rebrand Israel, especially in Toronto, as being queer-friendly. That's why QIA in Toronto's got attacked so much. There's been contingents in Ottawa, in Edmonton, in Winnipeg. I don't know about Halifax. They've not got the same flack at all. There's some particular features that are going on there. But there is this sort of mainstream notion now. I mean, people who are involved in the Pride Committee in Toronto say, Pride's not about politics. There's nothing political about Pride. It's just a celebration. There's nothing, in some ways, what they're really arguing is we've achieved everything we ever dreamed of, we ever could have imagined. There's nothing more that needs to happen. So to have a political group, they're basically arguing now that political groups, community-based political groups, of course the political parties could be there, but political groups really don't have a part in Pride, right? Which is a complete travesty. I was one of the founders also of the Toronto Lesbian and Gay Pride Committee in 1981, and it's that's not what we were trying to do in 1981, right? When we were chanting, pardon my language, fuck you 52 outside 52 Police Division, and I got in flack because I had to sign the permit for the parade that year. That's not what we were thinking of. This was a non-political event that wasn't related to our other struggles. So maybe I'll leave it there for now, and maybe other people can ask questions and make comments. I'm also really interested in what people have to say.
Go ahead.
I was hoping you could comment a little bit more. It's come up in some of the questions, but to pick up on Elaine's point about assimilation and the problems that poses for the movement. So my involvement in the LGBT movement has been mostly on the formal equality side, not the kind of radical demonstration that it's a different picture of the movement. But through the fight for same-sex marriage, which was an important but problematic fight, and through, for example, the current struggle, even in Parliament, advocacy for recognition of transgendered rights in the Canadian Human Rights Act, what we see is the portrayal of the face of the LGBT community as being this very mainstreamed face. So for same-sex marriage, the media wanted to see elderly lesbian couples who didn't show any affection but just held hands. And in when you hear the stories being told in advocacy of the trans rights, it's statements of support from family members, and a picture of one of the things that comments was, "We can't wait for the day when there's a transgendered person who's a member of parliament," which is a face of the community, but the talk around it sort of invisibilizes the more marginalized people in the transgendered community who might live on the economic margins or don't really fit their main goal in life is not to be a member of parliament. They probably have more basic struggles. So it's problematic. At the same time, it strikes me that it's a necessary part of the struggle for formal equality. I don't know that we could be talking about transgendered rights in parliament if we didn't, to some extent, mainstream it and make it more palatable, even as much as troubling as that is to me. So I just wondered your thoughts on that struggle.
I mean, I think the battles for formal legal equality have been absolutely incredible, right? I mean, when I first got involved in the gay liberation movement in the mid-'70s, I never dreamed of many of the things that have been able to be accomplished. But I mean, first of all, I think it's really important around the struggles for formal equality to recognize that it was actually the grassroots movements, community mobilizations, that opened up the space for those to take place. The other thing that's important is how the Charter, in its partial modification of legal state formation within the Canadian context, both was a major blessing for us. And I think retrospectively also something that we needed to be more critical of. Because what it did was it opened up the ability to make more rapid progress in some areas than others. And it opened up the possibility of especially arguments of we need to be integrated into existing social forms of the family, spouse, the military, even into national security. We need to be integrated into those social forms, and it made it easier for us to wage those types of struggles. So that was how we could advance. In terms of substantive social equality, I mean, maybe this is a way to think about it. I mean, it perplexes me that, same-sex marriage exists in the Canadian state. People think we have all these rights. But if you scratch the surface, you will find hate and violence towards queer people. And of course, young queer people in particular face the brunt of that because the social construction of masculinity in high schools and among young people is still based on incredible forms of heterosexism. It's how boys become men in some major ways in our society. And we actually have to take that on board. So if we don't deal with substantive equality, real, actual equality between people who identify as being heterosexual and people who identify as being lesbian or gay, and we simply leave it on the level of formal equality, we're not substantively changing people's everyday lives. And we're also excluding lots of people. So, I mean, the formal equality rights benefit sort of white middle class strata within queer communities much more than other people. And it's really important to fight for formal equality, but we sort of lost out on other dimensions of our struggle. I'll just give you one example. There was a historical moment when we were discussing spousal rights and spousal campaigns. When, the Coalition for Lesbian and Gay Rights in Ontario actually had a really incredible conference where we actually discussed, do we really want to follow this model that people should actually get benefits based on who you happen to have a relationship with? Is that a social justice model? Is that how we really want to redistribute resources in our society to people who might be poor or disadvantaged? But in the end, we actually opted for that model. The other thing was around notions of the family. Unfortunately for us, in some ways, those types of campaigns happened at the same time as a sort of radical critique of the family within the feminist movement was sort of in some ways falling away, right? So we weren't able to sort of draw upon that type of critique. So, I'm all in favor of fighting for formal equality rights, and I think sometimes you're right. Certain tactics have to be adopted. But we have to think those through. Who's actually being excluded? Who's being potentially hurt by those struggles? And how can we, I guess the biggest problem for me is that those grassroots, community-based organizations really don't exist much more across the Canadian state. I'm really not even sure there's a lesbian and gay movement, let alone a queer movement in this country. And in some ways we have to figure out how can we reignite that? Because there's pockets of activists everywhere that I go across this country who are having these same questions and having these same debates, but there's no forums or networks for these dialogues and discussions to really take place. So I know I haven't decisively answered your question, but at least hopefully that offers some observations around it.
Hi, Dr. Kinsman, thank you for your talk. I had a question about, well, you opened your talk with a troubling of the definition of Canadian and your use of the definition of Canadian, and you also paid tribute to the land that we're on. And there's been some questions about borders and sort of, what's the next direction for Kaya and, sort of solidarity movements. And I wondered what your thoughts were on queer organizing with First Nations groups in Canada to fight against, trying to work within the state structure, right, the nation-state structures, and how colonialism is so fundamental to, our understandings of sex and gender and hetero-patriarchal organization of society. And also that there is work being done, around with sort of fourth world, around, ideas around another world is possible by not relying on ideas or, looking for answers within the nation state. So I wondered what your thoughts are on that.
I mean, there's an awful lot that I could say about that. I mean, where I'm coming from lately is one of the theorists who I find most inspirational is actually John Holloway, who's making I think a really convincing argument, at least for me, that like trying to see the state and what I would refer to as the social form of law as the framework for our liberation is really a mistake. That we need to actually embark on other strategies and other tactics, which is not to say we ignore legal terrains and legal struggles. We have to fight on them, but to recognize that that's not our terrain. That's not where we're going to achieve liberation. We're also not going to achieve liberation by, electing the NDP to government, right? Or by having some radical Leninist party seize state control, right? Those are not the strategies for liberation. For us or anyone else, right? It has to come from the bottom up. It has to come from the types of forms of direct democracy that are being practiced by the Zapatistas in the Selva Lacandona. It has to come from the types of practices that were pioneered, that's a bad term to use, that were utilized in some of the aspects of the global justice movement, like affinity groups, spokes councils, when I went to Quebec City, it was the most profound experience of democracy I'd ever had. We were being attacked by tear gas all the time, but you had people making music in the midst of these tear gas clouds, right? You had local kids from Quebec City coming out with their hockey sticks and using their hockey sticks to beat the tear gas canisters back at the police. We had these spokes council meetings. We had a continuous meeting on our way back, all of us from Sudbury, in the bus. From Quebec City to Sudbury, right? A continuous sort of like spokes council meeting that lasted almost that whole time. We did take a couple of breaks. But an experience of like participatory democracy that is so different from what we usually experience. And it's those types of moments that we really have to grab onto. In terms of colonialism, I think it's absolutely central. And being located in Sudbury has one of the things that I've actually learned an awful lot has been working with Indigenous people. And learning from First Nations elders, and learning about different ways to do things, right? We're so tyrannized by clock time, and I realize this is not a critique of anyone trying to impose time restrictions here at the meeting, but, the elders I've heard from say, if you have an issue, right, that needs to be talked about, everyone should have the right to speak about it, and you should stay as long as necessary to try to clarify. It's a very, very different notion of how you might want to try to clarify differences. I think that recognizing the colonial character, the colonial settler state character of the Canadian state is really fundamental and crucial. And one of the things that means it's not simply a question of supporting the struggles of Indigenous people or supporting people of color, but it's also a question of those of us who identify as being white settlers or might be constructed by other people as being white settlers. How do we challenge that from the places that we're in, right? How do we open up spaces for Indigenous people and people of color? How do we challenge other white people about their racist and colonizing practices? And those are really important questions that I think we only started to talk about. But just one final comment, because I think you might have been getting at, is there a tension between sort of no one is illegal type positions of people being able to move around wherever they want to versus Indigenous nations arguing that this is our land? I think what you actually see is, yes, there are tensions, and those have to be worked through, but what I think you actually see in most Indigenous nations is a real notion that they're based on inclusion, right? And including the inclusion of non-Indigenous people, including other groups of Indigenous people in their communities and in their nations, which I think is a very different perspective and sort of, this is our boundary, this is our land, you stay out, right? Which is unfortunately the perspective we've often tried to impose on the world.
Okay, thank you. I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight, and I want to thank our two speakers, Gary Kinsman and Elaine Craig. I want to also remind you that there's a reception just across the hall. Books, Gary Kinsman's books for sale, and also to remind you that we'll be back here on March the 2nd with Judith Levine talking about children's sexuality. What are we afraid of? So thanks again, and hope to see you in March.